The place card with my name on it was not at the head table. It wasn't even in the room. I found that out at 6:14 p.m. Standing beside a gold-framed seating chart in the ballroom lobby, while my mother adjusted a strand of pearls at her throat and said, in that polished voice she used when she wanted cruelty to sound practical, "Darling, we assumed you understood. You'll be downstairs managing the vendor desk." For a second, I just looked at her. My brother's engagement party was upstairs. 212 guests, a jazz trio, imported orchids, champagne towers, a custom ice sculpture with their initials carved into it like they were royal. And me? I was apparently staff. Not a sister. Not family. Not even a guest. Just the woman who was expected to stand near the service entrance with a clipboard and solve problems quietly while everyone else celebrated. My brother, Adrian, didn't even look embarrassed. He straightened his cufflinks and said, "You're better at that stuff anyway. This isn't really your scene." I remember exactly how the hallway smelled. Gardenias from the floral arches and the cold metallic scent of hotel air conditioning. I remember what I was wearing too. Navy silk dress, low heels, grandmother's gold bracelet, the one thing I owned that made me feel like I belonged in a room like that. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there with my invitation still in my hand, reading my own name in embossed script like that meant anything. Then my mother leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Don't make this awkward, Elena. Tonight is important to your brother." That was the moment. Not because it hurt the most. There had been worse things before that. Years of them, actually. But that was the moment I understood they were never going to stop using me as long as I kept agreeing to be useful. So I smiled and said, "Of course." What none of them knew was that by the end of that same week, the ballroom, the vendor account, the bank line attached to the event company, and the entire polished little world they had built around Adrian's future would look very different. They had no idea what was about to happen. My name is Elena Morales. I was 34 years old when that happened. Let me know where you're watching from, and if you've ever been treated like the backup person in your own family, comment the word invisible. People who met my family from the outside thought we were elegant. That was the word people liked best. Elegant. My mother, Teresa, loved things that photographed well. Linen napkins, white roses, smooth lies. My father, Raphael, liked talking about legacy, reputation, and standards. He owned a mid-sized event company in San Diego that specialized in luxury weddings, charity galas, and private corporate dinners for people who wanted everything to look effortless. My brother Adrian was the visible future of that business. That was the family story anyway. He was charming, handsome, easy in a room, the kind of man older donors called impressive and younger women called magnetic. He knew how to smile while shaking hands. He knew how to talk about growth, expansion, and brand elevation without ever saying anything too specific. I was the older sister who handled details. That was their phrase. Elena handles details. If a florist threatened to walk because deposits hadn't cleared, I handled details. If a liquor permit had the wrong date, I handled details. If a bride's mother wanted a full table map redone at 10:30 p.m., the night before an event, I handled details. If Adrian forgot to send final approvals and my father wanted to blame a communication lapse, I handled details. And then at family dinners, if anyone asked what I did, my mother would smile and say, "Elena keeps us organized." Organized. As if I was a drawer divider with a pulse. The truth was less tidy. By the time I was 34, I had spent 11 years quietly saving my family's company from the kinds of mistakes that make elegant businesses suddenly look very cheap. I didn't have Adrian's title. He was vice president of client development by 31, which meant he took people to lunch and called himself strategic. I was listed as operations coordinator for 6 years, then senior internal logistics manager after I threatened to leave once. The title still didn't come close. I built their vendor compliance system. I rewrote their contract workflow. I created the emergency staffing matrix they still used at every major event. I negotiated 3 of their most profitable venue partnerships. I fixed 2 tax season filing messes my father pretended were temporary accounting misunderstandings. And in the 18 months before the engagement party, I had personally cleaned up $438,000 worth of booking risk tied to sloppy internal approvals Adrian kept pushing through without reading. Nobody outside the business knew that. Most people inside it did. But families like mine have a way of absorbing a daughter's labor until it stops looking like labor at all. It just becomes her nature, her role, her nice little strength. I should have known what I was to them years earlier. There were signs. When I was 16, my brother got a silver Honda for his birthday because, according to my father, a young man needs mobility. When I turned 16, my parents gave me a leather planner and told me I was so mature that I probably didn't need gifts to feel seen. I remember smiling, actually smiling, because when you grow up in a family like that, they train you to translate scraps into proof of love. At 22, when Adrian dropped out of graduate school after one semester because he found it limiting, my parents paid off the rest of his student housing contract and called it supporting his entrepreneurial spirit. At 22, I had already started covering weekend event shifts unpaid because one of the managers quit unexpectedly, and my father said, "You understand sacrifice better than your brother does." That was meant as praise. It took me years to understand it wasn't. Praise in my family often meant, "You are the one we can take from, without losing the image we want to keep." My one loyal person through all of this was Mara. Mara and I met when we were 24, both standing in the back hallway of a hotel ballroom at 11:47 p.m., eating dry shortbread cookies off a catering tray because dinner had never happened for either of us. She was a venue sales manager then, sharp-eyed, funny, impossible to impress with pedigree. Now she runs operations for a hospitality group that manages 4 boutique properties across Southern California. Mara was the first person who ever said my family's dynamic out loud in a way that couldn't be softened. 3 years before the engagement party, she looked at me across a stack of revised floor plans and said, "You know they don't treat you like family. They treat you like internal infrastructure." I laughed when she said it. Not because it was funny, because it was accurate enough to sting. Internal infrastructure. The hidden wiring. The thing inside the walls. Necessary, invisible, and only discussed when it breaks. That was me. And the most humiliating part wasn't even the work. I'm good at work. I've never minded being competent. What hurt was how casually my family would separate usefulness from worth. Adrian got asked what he envisioned. I got asked whether the rental invoices had been resent. Adrian's mistakes became growing pains. Mine became evidence that I was tense, difficult, too controlling, not warm enough. Even my mother's language told on her. If Adrian was late, she'd say he was stretched thin. If I pointed out a contract problem, she'd say I had a habit of making things heavier than they needed to be. He was potential. I was friction. That was the hierarchy. And because I wanted belonging more than I wanted clarity, I stayed inside it much longer than I should have. The engagement party should have been my warning 6 months earlier. I knew his fiancée, Camille, only a little. She was beautiful, polished, from a family my mother described as socially aligned, which told me everything I needed to know. Their engagement wasn't just personal, it was a merger of aesthetics. The party was being positioned as a family celebration, but it was also a showcase. For Adrian, for the business, for the image of succession my father had been grooming for years. And who do you think handled most of it? Not the flowers, not the speeches, not the glittering parts. The real parts. The permit revisions. The revised load-in schedule. The catering insurance certificate that came in with the wrong liquor rider. The broken refrigeration unit at the hotel 2 days before the event. The replacement dessert supplier I found at 9:20 p.m., when the original one had a staffing issue and tried to pull out. The silent fixes. The invisible things. The details. 3 days before the party, I was in the office at 8:43 p.m. finalizing revised place cards because Adrian had added 14 people to the guest list without telling anyone that 2 of them were allergic to shellfish and 1 of them couldn't sit near her ex-husband's new wife. He walked in, looked over my shoulder, and said, "You always make chaos look boring." I read that line in his voice for a long time afterward. It sounded like a compliment. It wasn't. What he meant was that he had grown so used to me absorbing the mess that he no longer registered the cost. Then came the seating chart. Then came the hallway. Then came my mother telling me not to make it awkward. I remember looking past her shoulder into the ballroom. The chandeliers were on dim gold. Waiters were carrying trays of sparkling water in cut crystal flutes. The string lights over the dance floor were already glowing. And all at once I saw the whole thing exactly as it was. Not a family celebration I had somehow been left out of. a machine I had helped build that no longer even bothered pretending I belonged inside it. I handed my invitation back to my mother, not dramatically, just placed it in her hand. Then I asked one quiet question. Who's covering vendor escalation if I'm downstairs all night? My father answered from behind Adrian without even thinking. You are. And that was the whole story right there. Not guest. Not sister. Not daughter, really. Coverage. I nodded once and said, understood. But what shifted inside me at 6:14 p.m. in that hotel hallway did not shift back. Because for the first time in my life, I stopped asking the wrong question. The wrong question was, how do I stay useful enough to be included? The right question was, what happens to all of this if I stop? The answer to that question had been building for years. What happens if I stop? At 34, I already knew enough to understand that most people do not value what they never have to notice. If the ballroom lights come on, the right chairs are in the right places, the contract riders are signed, the bride's mother gets her custom tea service, and the invoices go out without legal trouble, then people assume that is just how an event becomes an event. They do not think about the person who caught the missing indemnity clause at 11:08 p.m. They do not think about the one who called the refrigeration contractor back at 6:32 a.m. They do not think about the spreadsheet with 4 tabs and 9 color codes that kept a 5-figure floral order from being delivered to the wrong loading dock. They certainly do not think about her while seating her downstairs like staff at her own brother's engagement party. I did that work for so long that even I started talking about it too lightly. If someone outside the family asked what I did, I would say, I handle operations. That was true, but not enough. What I actually handled was risk. Reputation risk. Vendor risk. Timing risk. Licensing risk. The kind of financial risk that begins with one shrugged-off detail and ends with a client threatening not to pay the final 60% because the event failed in some visible, humiliating way. Luxury event companies survive on one thing more than style: trust. And trust is not built by the son who knows how to charm a donor over champagne. It is built by the woman nobody notices when she is doing her work well. That woman was me. For 11 years, I made my family's company look smoother, richer, and more stable than it was. When I started there at 23, the business had 14 regular staff members, inconsistent systems, and my father's old-school habit of storing critical client information in 3 places at once, none of them correctly. Contracts were partly digital, partly in folders, and partly in his head. Adrian was already there. Of course, walking around site visits in fitted jackets and talking about expansion before we could even track our own cancellation penalties properly. I remember my first month clearly because it was the first time I realized my father had not brought me in because he believed in me. He had brought me in because the company was fraying and I was the easiest person to ask for help without paying market value. The first week, he sat me in a narrow office with no window and gave me 4 banker's boxes full of unsigned vendor agreements, unpaid deposit reminders, duplicate booking forms, and 1 legal notice from a hotel that had nearly blacklisted us after a wedding planner on our side misrepresented overtime access. Can you make sense of this? He asked. Not hello. Not thank you for coming in. Just can you make sense of this? I did. In 19 days, I rebuilt the vendor filing system, identified $83,400 in outstanding receivables that had not been tracked properly, flagged 3 event files with permit exposure, and created the first real booking checklist the company had ever used. At the end of that month, my father bought Adrian a watch to celebrate how hard he's been pushing the business forward. I got told I had a good eye for order. That was my family in one scene. One person gets the symbol. One person gets the sentence. My mother reinforced it in softer ways. She wasn't cruel in a loud, obvious style. She was polished, social, the kind of woman who could insult you in a voice warm enough to confuse everybody else in the room. If Adrian forgot an anniversary booking detail and I stepped in to fix it, she'd say, "That's why it's nice to have different children with different strengths." Nice. As if one child had vision and the other was a drawer organizer with a pulse. When I turned 29, she gave me a monogrammed document folio for Christmas and said, "This is more you than jewelry, don't you think?" At the same dinner, Adrian got an investment account contribution because my father wanted him thinking like an owner. I remember wrapping my fingers around the folio and smiling because everyone was watching. I remember driving home afterward and putting it on the passenger seat and crying at a red light like an idiot because what hurt was not the gift. It was how accurately it measured what they thought I deserved. A useful accessory. A tidy little tool. Something practical for the daughter who kept things in order while the son was taught to build wealth. What none of them asked, because they never really asked me about anything that mattered, was what I was building outside them. That was the hidden part. Not because I was secretive by nature, because nobody cared enough to ask the second question. How's work, Elena? Busy. That's nice, honey. That was the full exchange most of the time. Meanwhile, outside the family company, my actual professional life had become much bigger than they understood. By 31, I had started taking independent consulting clients quietly on the side, not wedding clients, venue recovery work, process repair, small boutique hotels and event spaces that had good aesthetics and bad back-end systems. The first client was a 4-2-room hotel in La Jolla that needed help rebuilding its event compliance workflow after 2 ugly cancellation disputes. They paid me $4,800 for a 3-week review. I did the work at night after family events, sitting at my apartment dining table with my laptop open and legal pads everywhere. That $4,800 became $11,200 over the next 3 months when they referred me to a sister property. Then one of Mara's hospitality contacts asked if I could help streamline vendor onboarding for a private members club in Orange County. Then a boutique venue in Pasadena. Then a museum events team that needed contract revision support because they were losing money every time a client moved a date. By 33, my side work had become an actual company. Quiet Ledger Consulting. I know, not the sexiest name. But it fit. Quiet. Because nobody notices the structure until it fails. Ledger. Because every glamorous mess eventually becomes numbers. Consulting. Because by then, that was what I was doing whether my family respected it or not. My first full-year revenue was $146,000. My second was $312,000. The year of Adrian's engagement party, I was on track to close just over $487,000 with 6 recurring clients and 1 larger hospitality systems contract scheduled to start in September. Nobody in my family knew. Not because I was hiding Ferraris and secret awards in a warehouse somewhere, because they never asked enough to find out. They saw me leave their office late and assumed I went home tired. They saw me reading contracts at brunch once, and my mother joked, "Do you ever stop working?" No curiosity. No follow-up. No idea that I had already opened a separate business account, retained my own accountant, and built something they would have respected instantly if Adrian had done it. That was the sharpest part of all. I wasn't invisible because I had nothing. I was invisible because they had decided what counted before they ever bothered learning who I was. My one meaningful object through all of this was my grandmother's bracelet. Thin gold, slightly dented on one side, clasp a little stubborn. She gave it to me when I was 25 and said, "Wear this when you need to remember that steadiness is not the same as smallness." She had been a seamstress for 40 years, tiny woman, quiet. Nobody in the family ever described her as powerful, but everybody brought her their damaged things and trusted her hands to fix them. I used to run my thumb over that bracelet whenever my father talked over me in meetings, or my mother introduced me as the practical one. I wore it to every major client negotiation in my own business. I wore it to the engagement party, too. That matters because when I stood in that hotel hallway being demoted from sister to coverage, I looked down and saw that bracelet on my wrist and thought, not this time. My loyal person, Mara, saw the shift before anyone else. She was actually at the engagement party, technically working with one of the hotel groups supplying temporary service staff that night. She caught sight of me near the vendor desk around 6:40. Standing beside stacked welcome boxes and a tray of escort cards that had been delivered in the wrong order. She walked over, took one look at my face, and said, "What happened?" I told her in 3 sentences. She didn't gasp. Didn't say, "No way." Didn't overperform sympathy. She just looked toward the ballroom entrance where my brother and future sister-in-law were posing for photographs under $900 worth of white orchids and said, so they finally said the quiet part out loud. Yes. That was exactly what they had done. For years, the disrespect had stayed coded. You understand, don't you? It's important to your brother. This isn't really your world. You're so much better at the behind-the-scenes side. We just want what's best. Don't be sensitive. Don't make this awkward. The engagement party was the first time they stopped pretending I was both family and labor. That was the hidden success part too, in a way. Because while my parents were still treating me like support staff with a bloodline, I had already built the professional identity they claimed I lacked. I had clients who paid me on time and thanked me by name. I had one museum contract worth $82,000 over 10 months. I had a private hospitality group in Santa Barbara that trusted me enough to hand over a complete systems rebuild for their events team. I had $318,000 in personal savings across business and personal accounts. I had no debt except a modest car payment. And 3 weeks before the engagement party, I had made an offer on a small condo in Mission Hills with 2 bedrooms, a narrow balcony, and enough morning light in the kitchen to make me irrationally emotional the first time I saw it. The purchase wasn't final yet. Inspection period still open, financing not locked. I told no one in my family because there is a particular kind of joy that gets ruined the minute dismissive people know about it. I wanted one thing that was mine before they could talk over it. That was why the hallway moment hit so hard. Not because I still thought they might transform into better people under chandeliers. Because I had done everything, built everything, learned everything, held their business together and quietly built my own. And still, in their minds, Adrian was the future and I was the woman with the clipboard. I stood at that vendor desk until 8:12. That's the part people always misunderstand when they imagine quiet justice. They think the shift means immediate explosion, immediate exit, immediate speech. Usually, it doesn't. Usually, the first thing you do after clarity is finish the task in front of you. So I did. I fixed a missing wine count issue. I reassigned a server who was about to leave early due to a scheduling error. I corrected the menu cards when the venue printed Camille's middle name wrong. I handled a minor disaster with the dessert station because the refrigeration on one side was running warm. I made the evening look seamless. And while I did all of that, something in me was leaving. At 8:47, I watched Adrian from the edge of the ballroom thanking people for believing in him. Believing in him. My mother was standing beside him, beaming in silver satin. My father had one arm around a donor he'd been chasing for 6 months. And I realized that if I stayed in their company much longer, they would keep turning my life into support material for his. Not because they were villains in a movie. Because it was convenient. Because I had made it convenient. Because my competence had insulated them from the cost of undervaluing me for so long that they no longer believed there would ever be one. That was when the internal shift happened. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a clean thought, landing fully formed in my mind while a waiter passed with smoked salmon blindness, and someone in the corner laughed too hard at a joke they did not understand. I am done making their version of me profitable. That was the sentence. I repeated it in my head twice. Then I took out my phone and sent myself an email with the subject line, "After tonight." Inside it, I wrote 4 notes. Review all company system access. Pull independent vendor contact list. Separate personal client files from family server. Call attorney Monday. I read it once before sending. Then I slipped my phone back into my clutch, adjusted my bracelet, and went back to the ballroom just long enough to smile at the people who still thought I was part of the celebration. By the end of the night, I had done one more thing too. Something small. Something quiet. Something that would matter later. I took a full copy of the event reconciliation folder home with me. Not to sabotage anyone. To make sure I could prove what belonged to me when the time came. Because after 11 years in that family, I knew one thing for certain. The moment you stop being useful, people who benefited from your labor get very creative about who did what. And by Sunday morning, when my mother called to ask if I could come in early Monday to help clean up a few loose ends from the party, I already knew I wasn't coming back the same way. My mother called at 9:18 Sunday morning. I remember the time because I was standing barefoot in my kitchen, pouring coffee, when her name lit up my screen. The condo brochure was still on the counter from the night before, folded open to the floor plan with the narrow balcony and the little square breakfast area I already loved more than I wanted to admit. I let the phone ring twice before answering. "Hi, Mom." "No, how are you?" "No, thank you for yesterday." No mention of the fact that she had turned her daughter into unpaid event staff in heels. She went straight to it. "We need you in early tomorrow. There are a few loose ends from the party, and Adrian has meetings all week." Of course he did. I leaned against the counter and looked out the window. What kind of loose ends? The dessert reconciliation, the revised guest billing, 2 vendor disputes, and the Wilcox inquiry. Nothing major. You're better at that stuff anyway. That sentence did something to me. Not because it was new, because it was so familiar, so casual, so automatic. She said it the way people ask for napkins. Like my labor was already theirs and we were just discussing timing. I stirred my coffee and asked, "Did Adrian ask you to call?" A pause. Then, "We all need to pull together after a big event, Elena. You know how these things work." Yes. That was exactly the problem. I knew how these things worked. I knew that Adrian would get photographed in a custom tuxedo under imported orchids while I stayed late fixing an invoicing problem caused by one of his verbal approvals. I knew my father would call me tense if I raised the risk issue, then call me privately at 10:30 p.m. to ask if I had fixed it yet. I knew my mother would describe me as difficult in public and dependable in emergencies, like those were somehow separate qualities. I knew that if I came in Monday, I would solve the loose ends. Then Tuesday would come, then the next event, then the next family celebration where I would be useful but not visible. That was the cutoff moment, not the hallway. That showed me the truth. Sunday morning was when I decided what to do with it. I set my spoon down and said, very calmly, "I'm not coming in tomorrow." Silence. Not long, but long enough. Then my mother laughed softly, the way she did when she thought I was being emotional and temporary. "Elena, don't be childish." I didn't react to that. I had spent years reacting, explaining, clarifying, trying to make myself legible to people committed to misunderstanding me because it was easier than respecting me. So I said, "I'm not being childish, I'm resigning." This time the silence lasted. I could hear a TV on in the background at her house, some morning show host sounding falsely cheerful. I could picture her in the breakfast nook, one hand on the marble countertop, trying to decide whether this was a bluff. Finally, she said, "Don't be ridiculous." I looked at the condo brochure again. "I'm not." Over one misunderstanding at a party? There wasn't any misunderstanding. Her voice sharpened. "You are seriously going to punish this family because your feelings were hurt?" That word. Punish. As if stepping away from exploitation was an attack. As if my continued labor was the moral baseline and anything else was cruelty. I took a breath. "No. I'm stepping away because you made my role very clear." "And what exactly does that mean?" "It means," I said, "that I'm apparently good enough to fix everything and not important enough to be treated like family. So you can find someone else to handle the details." She went quiet again, then tried a different tone. Softer, more wounded. The one she used when she wanted to make me feel like the aggressor. "Your father will be devastated." No, he wouldn't. He would be inconvenienced. That silence told me more than her answer. I said, "I'll send something in writing." Then I hung up. My hands were shaking afterward, which annoyed me. Not because I regretted it, because part of me still wanted them to make it easy. To say, "Wait, Elena, we've treated you terribly." To hand me a clean moral landscape instead of the messy one that actually exists in families where love and use get tangled together. But they didn't. They never had. So I made another coffee, opened my laptop at 9:31, and started the withdrawal properly. I did not write a dramatic resignation letter. I wrote a professional one. Short. Clear. Timestamped. Effective immediately. I am resigning from Morales Events Group in all operational, vendor management, contract administration, and internal logistics functions. Please consider this notice my formal withdrawal from current and future event execution responsibilities. I will provide a written transition summary for active files by 4 p.m. today. After that point, I will not be available for ongoing event support, client communications, or emergency issue resolution. I read it twice. Then I added one more sentence. Please note that all independent consulting work, proprietary workflow templates created outside company scope, and personal client contacts not held under company contract remain separate from Morales Events Group and are not authorized for internal use after my departure. That sentence mattered. A lot. Because over the years, the lines had blurred in all the ways families like mine depend on blurring. I had built systems on my own time, relationship maps, escalation frameworks, vendor scoring sheets, recovery protocols, pricing templates, email language that smoothed over problems before they became lawsuits. Some of it had been built directly for the company. Some of it had been built from my own consulting practice, adapted in pieces because I was trying to help. Too much help, if I'm honest. I was done donating invisible assets to people who would call me dramatic the second I stopped. At 9:47, I sent the letter to my father, mother, brother, the company bookkeeper, and the office manager. At 9:52, Adrian called. I didn't answer. At 9:55, my father called. I didn't answer that either. At 10:01, Adrian texted. What the hell is this? At 10:04, my father emailed. Do not do this impulsively. Come in tomorrow and we'll speak like adults. That almost made me laugh. Like adults. As if I had not been the only adult in their business for years. I replied once, in writing only. This is not impulsive. Transition summary by 4 p.m., as stated. Then I turned my phone face down and began the real work. Quiet withdrawal is work. People never understand that. It is not storming out. It is not breaking things. It is not one satisfying speech in a doorway. It is method. At 10:12, I logged into the company server and began copying my personal records and side business documents out of shared folders they never should have touched. At 10:39, I separated 6 years of vendor contacts into 3 categories: company-owned, jointly developed, and independently originated. At 11:08, I removed my personal payment details from 2 recurring software subscriptions I had covered myself for nearly 14 months because no one else had bothered to renew them on time. At 11:31, I downloaded the full event calendar, active deposits ledger, and upcoming vendor deadlines sheet, then created a transition memo so no one could claim later that I had left them blind. That mattered to me. I wasn't trying to destroy the company. I was trying to step away cleanly. There is a difference. By 12:14, I had documented 12 active issues they would need to manage without me. The Wilcox Gala deposit discrepancy, the pending venue amendment for the Sorensen wedding, a missing floral insurance rider for the Leland fundraiser, 2 custom linen invoices still awaiting client approval, 1 liquor permit correction, 3 unresolved staffing shortfalls for the next holiday weekend, and 1 especially ugly dessert vendor dispute I knew Adrian had no idea how to handle because he had caused it by promising a custom late edition without checking labor capacity. I listed each one. Current status. Needed action. Deadline. Contact person. Risk if ignored. That was my gift to them. Not kindness exactly. Not anymore. Clean separation. Mara came over around 1 with Thai food and took one look at the papers spread across my dining table and said, "You really mean it." Yes. She set the food down, pulled out a chair, and sat. Good. I smiled a little. That's becoming your favorite word. It fits. We ate in silence for a few minutes. Then she asked the one question that mattered most. What are you most afraid of? I thought about that. Not money. I had my own money. Not work. I had my own work. Not even the company collapsing, if I'm honest. They had built that risk themselves. What I was afraid of was smaller and sadder. That they'll make me sound cruel, I said. Mara nodded immediately, like she had expected exactly that answer. They will, she said. At first. That hurt because it was true. In families like mine, the person who stops carrying the weight is always accused of dropping it. Around 1:46, my mother texted again. Your grandmother would be ashamed of this. That one landed low. I didn't answer it right away. I just stared at the screen and let myself feel the ugliness of it. Not because I believed her, because she knew exactly where to place the knife. Then I looked down at my grandmother's bracelet on my wrist. Steadiness is not the same as smallness. I put the phone down without replying. At 2:03, my father tried a new tactic. He emailed asking for all current passwords and account controls for continuity. I answered with a formal list, limited strictly to company-owned systems, and noted which subscriptions were personal and would terminate. At the next billing cycle. At 2:40, Adrian called from a different number. This time I answered. He didn't say hello. You're unbelievable. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the legal pad in front of me where I had already started writing times. Is there a question in there? Oh, don't do that voice with me. What do you need, Adrian? He exhaled sharply. You cannot walk because of one stupid seating mix-up. There it was. The minimizing, the reduction, the translating of years into one unfortunate little misunderstanding. It wasn't a mix-up. You're seriously blowing up the business over a chair? No, I said. I'm stepping away from a pattern. He laughed, but not well. You always talk like this when you want to make yourself the martyr. That sentence made something inside me go very still. I said, Who fixed the Wilcox deposit issue last month? Silence. Then, what? Who fixed the Wilcox deposit issue? You did. Who rewrote the Bartlett contract after you approved the wrong cancellation language? Another pause. You did. Who handled the venue salvage on Camille's friend's rehearsal dinner after your timeline fell apart? He didn't answer. I went on. Who stayed at the hotel until 1:15 Saturday morning fixing a dessert vendor problem you caused while you were upstairs taking photos? His voice changed then, less angry, more careful. That's your job. No. That was the old script. I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to hear himself. Then I said, not anymore. And I hung up. That was the internal shift becoming real. Not just private clarity. Action. At 3:22, I sent the transition memo. At 3:37, I revoked my personal cloud drives from the shared office desktop. At 3:51, I forwarded my final invoice from Quiet Ledger's largest private client because I wanted the reminder on my screen. I had a life outside them, a real one, specific, profitable. Mine. At exactly 4 p.m., I sent my last email. Transition materials attached. No further operational support available after today. Then I shut the laptop. The room went quiet. That kind of quiet feels strange the first time, not triumphant. More like stepping off a moving walkway and realizing how long you had been letting it carry you where other people wanted you to go. At 4:13, Mara looked at me and said, "Now don't answer them." That sounded easy. It wasn't. Because starting at 4:19, the calls began in waves. My father, my mother, Adrian, office manager, bookkeeper, my aunt. Then Camille, which was new. By 5:07, I had 11 missed calls and 4 voicemails. I listened to none of them. I read only the texts. We need the Leland floral file. Call me now. This is ridiculous. You're making a huge mistake. Please don't do this tonight. Clients are already asking questions. That last one told me more than anything else. Clients are already asking questions. Of course they were. Because the systems I built were not decorative, they were load-bearing. And once I withdrew, the little cracks my family had always dismissed as manageable started showing all at once. That evening, at 7:26, I got the first message from someone outside the family. It was from Camille. "Can we talk? I don't think Adrian told me how much you actually do." I stared at that one for a long time. Because there it was again. Actually do. People never ask until the floor shifts under them. I didn't answer her that night. Instead, I opened the condo paperwork, reviewed the inspection amendments, and sent my mortgage broker the final requested bank statement at 8:03 p.m. That was my setup for the reveal, though I didn't call it that then. Not revenge. Not strategy. Alignment. My family was panicking because I had stopped carrying the invisible weight. And in 3 days, at a charity launch dinner where my father was supposed to stand in front of clients and donors and talk about the company's future, that absence was going to become impossible to hide. The charity launch dinner was on Wednesday night at the Valencia House downtown. I know that because I had built the run sheet myself 3 weeks earlier, before the engagement party, before the hallway, before the resignation. It was one of my family's favorite kinds of events. Half philanthropy, half sales strategy. A room full of donors, venue owners, old clients, and exactly the sort of people my father liked standing in front of while pretending the company ran on charm and legacy. He was supposed to give a short speech at 7:40. Adrian was supposed to work the room. Camille was supposed to look polished and newly welcomed into the family. And I was supposed to have made all the invisible things disappear before any of them arrived. That was the old plan. By Wednesday morning, the new one was already writing itself. At 8:12 a.m., the floral company emailed that they were still waiting on final written approval for the Leland arrangements and would not load the truck without it. At opt. Doazet Shishase. The venue reached out because the revised guest count had not matched the service order. At 8:41, the dessert supplier asked who was now authorized to confirm quantities because Elena usually closes these. At 9:03, one of the hotel event managers I knew well texted me privately. "Did you really leave? Your dad looks like he hasn't slept." I stared at that screen and felt exactly what I had felt with Kestrel in the earlier story. Not joy, not victory, just the quiet, sad shape of consequence arriving on schedule. By 10:17, Camille called again. This time I answered. Her voice was lower than usual, less social, less certain. Elena, I need to ask you something and I need the truth. All right. Is Adrian actually able to run this company without you? There are questions that expose more than answers do. I sat down at my desk and looked out toward the courtyard behind my apartment. Why are you asking me now? A pause. Because your father snapped at 2 vendors this morning. Adrian's acting like everything is fine, but nothing seems fine. And I walked into the office an hour ago and found 3 different people asking where you kept things. Where I kept things. That nearly made me smile. Not because it was funny, because it was such a perfect summary of how my work had lived in that company. In drawers, in systems, in relationships, in my head. So constant that nobody thought to ask how much of the structure was actually me until I was gone. I answered carefully. Your question isn't really whether he can run it without me. It's whether anyone there understood what I was holding together. She was quiet. Then she said, Did they? No. That silence lasted a few seconds. Then Camille asked, Would you come tonight? Not to help. Not this time. She meant something else, and we both knew it. I read the room underneath her question very clearly. She had seen enough over the previous 3 days to understand that the family version of me and the operational version of me were not the same person. She also understood, maybe for the first time, that the company she was marrying into was less stable than Adrian had made it sound. I didn't answer right away. Then I said, I'll come as a guest. At 11:02, Mara called and said, You're going, aren't you? Yes. Good. Wear the bracelet. That made me laugh a little. At this point, it feels attached to me. That's the idea. I spent the afternoon like I always do before walking into a room where people will underestimate me, quietly. I showered. I ironed a black dress I hadn't worn in months. I printed 3 things and slipped them into a slim leather folder. First, the resignation email. Second, the transition memo. Third, a 1-page summary showing exactly which systems, contacts, and operational functions had been under my control and when they had been formally transferred or declined after my exit. Not to wave around. Not to humiliate anyone. To anchor the truth if someone tried to turn me into the unstable daughter who walked out for attention. At 6:52 p.m., I arrived at Valencia House. The ballroom lobby smelled like citrus polish and candles, the kind of expensive neutral scent luxury venues use when they want every event to feel vaguely timeless. Staff were moving quickly, but not smoothly. I could tell within 15 seconds. One waiter was carrying corrected menu cards by hand, which meant the original print run had been wrong. A venue manager I knew from past events was speaking too quietly into a headset, which usually meant she was covering for client disorganization. And the floral installation near the stage was beautiful but incomplete on the left side, which told me someone had reduced the order without properly redesigning the balance. Small things. Load-bearing things. I hadn't even reached the ballroom doors when one of the audio-visual technicians, a man named Luis I'd worked with at least 10 times, saw me and said, Thank God. I stopped. He realized what he had said and straightened immediately. Sorry. I just meant they're having trouble with the speech deck, and your father said you weren't involved anymore, and then Adrian told me to just figure it out. Just figure it out. I had heard that tone before, that easy panic people use when they're accustomed to offloading the thinking onto someone else. I'm not involved, I said calmly. He nodded, embarrassed. Right. Sorry. I kept walking. That was important too. Quiet justice isn't secretly fixing everything from the shadows so the people who used you can keep their image intact. Sometimes it is simply refusing to resume the old role. Inside the ballroom, the room looked perfect if you didn't know what perfect costs. Gold candlelight. Cream linens. A little raised stage with the foundation logo projected behind it. Donor cards at each setting. The kind of event my father loved because it made him look civic instead of commercial. He saw me almost immediately. I watched the exact moment his face changed. Not anger first. Calculation. Because my father always understood image before emotion. He crossed the room toward me with a smile already in place. Elena. His voice was warm enough for nearby guests to hear affection. I said, Good evening. You decided to come. I was invited. That landed. Small sentence. Clean edge. His smile tightened just slightly. We should talk privately. No. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't whisper either. Just know that, more than anything, unsettles people who are used to moving women into quieter corners so they can rewrite the room. My father leaned closer. This is not the time. I looked around the ballroom. 200 people, maybe a little less than the engagement party, but wealthier on average and more professionally useful. A room designed for appearances. You're right, I said. That was Sunday. His eyes flicked toward the nearest table where two donors were watching us without pretending not to. That was when Adrian arrived. He looked good, which made what was happening to him somehow sadder. Navy suit, expensive watch, the confidence still on him in outline, even though the substance had started to leak out 3 days earlier. Elena, he said, with that careful tone people use when they're trying not to sound desperate in public. Can we just get through tonight? There it was again. Not I'm sorry. Not we were wrong. Not we treated you terribly. Can you help us survive the consequences of how we treated you? I said, that depends. He stared at me. On what? On whether anyone here is still being told I'm handling things. That was the question. The sharp one. The one quiet enough to puncture everything. Adrian glanced toward my father, and that glance told me everything I needed. He didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. I said, so yes. Before he could respond, Camille stepped into the circle. She looked tired, beautiful still, but tired. The kind of tired that comes from spending 3 days realizing the story you were handed about a family was a polished brochure, not a structure. She looked at Adrian, not me, and asked, are you still telling people Elena's covering operations? The silence that followed was one of the most satisfying sounds I have ever heard, not because it was dramatic, but because it was public and unavoidable. My father spoke first. No one is misleading anyone. I opened the leather folder and took out the one-page summary. Not dramatically. Just set it on the cocktail table beside us. This is the transition record. It shows exactly what I resigned from, what was transferred, and what I declined to continue after 4 p.m. Sunday. If anyone in this room has been told otherwise, that's not confusion, that's a choice. Camille picked it up before Adrian could. She read it quickly, then once more, slower. I watched her eyes stop on 3 lines in particular. Vendor Escalation Authority, Contract Amendment Control, Event Reconciliation Sign-Off. All marked formerly handled by Elena Morales. All marked no longer available. She looked up at Adrian. You told my parents Monday that Elena was still just finalizing some back-end things. He opened his mouth. Camille didn't let him speak. You said it was basically under control. Around us, the room had started doing that subtle thing rooms do when people sense something true is happening nearby and begin listening without turning their heads yet. I stayed completely still. No rescue. No over-explaining. Adrian said, it was under control. I answered before Camille could. No, it was under me. That line landed harder than I even expected it to. Because it was not clever. It was simply true. Mara had been right when she called me internal infrastructure. They had not built control. They had outsourced it into my body, my memory, my labor, my timing, and then acted surprised when it left with me. At 7:36, the venue manager approached with the kind of smile hospitality people wear when they are one staffing problem away from mutiny. Mr. Morales, we need final confirmation on the donor table revision and the revised dessert count. She looked at me reflexively after she said it, then caught herself. That one moment told the whole story better than a speech ever could. My father noticed it too. He said, too quickly, Adrian can handle it. The venue manager nodded, but not convincingly. Then she asked the question that ended it. Should we still be using Elena's final event matrix as controlling, or has that been superseded in writing? I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Because now it wasn't family. It wasn't emotion. It was operations, witnesses, and a direct question in a room full of people whose money and reputations depended on clean answers. My father looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at the venue manager. Camille looked at both of them. No one answered quickly enough. That was the public reveal. Not some loud announcement. Not a spotlight speech. Not me exposing them for sport. Just the room finally seeing what I had actually been. The person they built around while pretending I was decorative. The venue manager, still waiting, finally looked at me and asked, Elena? I answered clearly. My materials are no longer controlling. I resigned on Sunday and documented the transfer limitations in writing. The room shifted. You could feel it. Not chaos. Recognition. A donor at the nearest table stopped pretending to read the program. One of the hotel executives raised his eyebrows very slightly. Camille set the summary page down like it had weight. And my father, for the first time in maybe my whole life, had no polished sentence ready. At 7:40, he was supposed to be on stage giving the foundation speech. At 7:40 exactly, he was instead standing beside a cocktail table in silence while the woman he had treated like backup labor quietly explained to a room full of useful people that the systems he relied on had left with her 3 days earlier. That was the family shock part. Not because they learned I was successful. That came later and smaller. Because they learned I was central. There's a difference. A few minutes later, after the venue manager walked away to recalibrate the event around new facts, Camille asked me, very quietly, "What do you want?" Same question people always ask when consequences finally arrive. As if boundaries are negotiations. As if truth is leverage. As if women only stop protecting systems because they want something in return. I looked at her. "I want accuracy." Then I closed the folder. My father said, "Elena, enough." Not angry. Scared. I met his eyes and said the briefest, clearest thing I had maybe ever said to him. No, enough was Sunday. Then I turned and walked out of the ballroom without waiting for permission, applause, or collapse. The confrontation came the next morning in my father's office. Private. Bright. Too late. And this time, when I put documentation on the table, there was nothing left for them to hide behind. My father's office smelled like stale espresso and the cologne he wore when he wanted to feel composed. I got there at 9:06 the next morning. He was already inside. Adrian was standing by the window with his jacket off, sleeves rolled once, like that made him look less like a man in trouble and more like someone doing practical work. My mother sat in one of the leather guest chairs with her handbag still on her lap, as if she planned to leave the second the room turned against her. Camille was there too, which I had not expected, and that told me more than anyone's face did. Whatever happened at the ballroom had not stayed inside the ballroom. I didn't rush. I set my folder on the conference end of the desk, took the chair farthest from my father, and folded my hands. No one offered coffee. No one asked how I was. No one said they were sorry. That is how you know a family meeting is really a damage meeting. My father started. What happened last night was unnecessary. I looked at him for a second. Then I said, no, what happened last night was visible. That silence told me more than his next sentence ever could. He had no response ready for visible, because that was the whole problem. Families like mine can survive almost anything as long as the truth stays inside the walls. What they cannot survive well is witnesses. Adrian pushed off from the window. You embarrassed us. I turned toward him. You were already embarrassed. I just wasn't carrying it for you anymore. That landed harder than I expected. He looked away first. My mother finally spoke, soft and polished, the way she did when she wanted reason to sound like generosity. Elena, nobody is saying you haven't worked hard. Worked hard. I almost smiled. That was the family translation they always used when they wanted to reduce expertise into effort. Worked hard. Helpful, organized, reliable. Words that sound respectful until you notice how carefully they avoid saying valuable, essential, or irreplaceable. I opened my folder and laid the documents on the desk one by one. My resignation email, the transition memo, the one-page authority summary, 3 screenshots of messages sent after I had already withdrawn, a printed copy of the event matrix showing my name still embedded in the active chain, and, finally, an invoice summary sheet covering the last 18 months of risk correction work I had done internally without title adjustment, bonus, or formal compensation. I placed that one last. Not dramatically, just last. My father stared at the papers. What is this? I answered simply. What I should have put in front of you years ago. Camille leaned forward first. She read faster than the others. Her eyes moved across the dates, the timestamps, the notes, the repeated pattern. She stopped at the invoice summary. August 14, lender, timing correction, 11.2 hours. September 3, venue breach salvage 8.7 hours. October 29, client contract redline recovery, 14.6 hours. January 11, deposit exposure reconciliation, 6.1 hours. March 7, floral liability issue, 4.8 hours. And on and on. I had totaled it the night before. 483 uncompensated hours over 18 months, outside my stated role. Most of them tied directly to mistakes caused by Adrian's verbal approvals or my father's insistence on moving before documentation was ready. Camille read the total out loud before anyone else could. 483 hours? No one answered. So I did. Yes. I kept my voice even. That is the documented amount for the last 18 months only, not 11 years, not the full history, just the part I can prove cleanly without dragging us into a museum of older damage. My mother looked stunned, which irritated me more than anger would have. Because of course she was stunned. They had never counted. People almost never count what women absorb quietly for them. Adrian tried next. That's inflated. I slid one more page toward him. A backup breakdown. Dated files. Cross-referenced calendars. Email trails. No, I said. Inflated would be if I counted the weekend calls and the client smoothing you did under my wording without acknowledging it. That silence lasted longer. My father finally asked the question I had been expecting since Sunday. What do you want? Again. Always that question. As if dignity is a negotiation position. As if clear boundaries must be a demand waiting to be priced. I let him sit in it for a second, then answered. I want my name removed from every live operational document, every presentation matrix, every vendor pathway, every internal workflow where I no longer hold authority. I want formal written notice sent to venue partners and active clients clarifying that I am no longer acting in an internal capacity for Morales Events Group. I want payment for the last 3 unreimbursed private software renewals and the outstanding personal expenses I covered on company urgency, and I want one more thing. No one moved. I looked directly at my father. You will stop describing me as support staff in rooms where my work is the only reason your image still stands up. My mother's face changed at that. Not into guilt exactly, more like discomfort finally finding its proper name. My father sat back. You're making this into something cruel. I nodded once. That's because you only recognize a boundary when it stops benefiting you. Camille closed her eyes for a second. Adrian muttered something under his breath. My mother stared at the desk, like the wood grain might produce a kinder daughter than the one sitting in front of her. Then came the part that mattered most. My father said, You know your brother was always meant to lead. There it was. The plain version. At last, not hidden in praise. Not wrapped in family mythology. Just said. I could have cried then. Maybe. Not because it surprised me. Because hearing the truth cleanly is sometimes more painful than the lie. Instead, I said, Yes, I know. That's why you taught him visibility and taught me endurance. No one answered that. Because what were they going to say? That I was wrong? The documents on the desk were one kind of proof, but there is another kind that lives in everybody's memory once someone says it out loud. My mother reached for a softer landing. You know we love you. I looked at her and thought, maybe you do, in your way. In the polished, practical, deeply conditional way that asks a daughter to become useful enough to deserve softness and then still calls her difficult when she asks to be seen. But love without respect is just appetite with prettier language. So I said, That hasn't been the problem. And I stood up. No speech. No dramatic exit. No scene. Just clear terms. I gathered the pages they did not need to keep, left the copies they did, and told them my attorney would send over the reimbursement summary and formal name use notice by the end of the day. Camille stood up too. Elena. I paused. She looked at me with a kind of tired honesty I hadn't seen in her before. I didn't know. I know, I said. And I did. At least partly. Camille had benefited from the family system, but she had not built it. She had walked into the polished version the same way people always did. I left the office at 9:47 a.m. I documented the time in the elevator because by then I had gotten used to marking endings. The aftermath was slower than people think these things are. There was no instant bankruptcy. No screaming match in a driveway. No dramatic collapse that would have made a better thumbnail. It was more realistic than that. The company kept operating because businesses usually do, even wounded ones, but they operated differently. Slower. More carefully. Less confidently. 2 clients requested revised points of contact within the week. 1 venue group asked for written clarification on authority chains. The floral supplier moved Morales Events to tighter payment terms. The Leland account did not cancel, but it did scale down. The Wilcox family chose a different firm for their December gala. And one of the private hotel groups I had quietly stabilized over the years sent a note through Mara asking whether Quiet Ledger Consulting had room for a new operational retainer in Q4. I read that email twice. Then I accepted. That contract alone was worth $96,000 over 8 months. 3 weeks later, I closed on the condo in Mission Hills. Purchase price after final inspection credit, $684,000. Down payment wired at 9:14 a.m. on a Thursday. Keys handed over at 2:22 p.m. The first thing I brought inside was not a lamp or a box of dishes. It was my grandmother's bracelet case and the leather folio my mother once gave me because she thought paperwork suited me better than jewelry. I set both on the kitchen counter and laughed for a solid 10 seconds. Not because it was hysterical, because life can be very dry in its sense of humor sometimes. She had been right, in a way. Paperwork did suit me. It bought me my own home. Mara came over that evening with takeout and 2 folding chairs because my real furniture had not arrived yet. We sat on the floor eating noodles out of cartons while the sunset came through the balcony doors and painted the empty walls gold. She looked around and said, "This is the first room I've ever seen you in that doesn't already belong to someone else's emergency." That one stayed with me, because it was true. The condo was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 narrow balcony, a kitchen that made me happy for no reason except light, but every inch of it felt like a sentence I had finally finished. Mine. There was one person in my family I still helped, but I did it separately, quietly, and on purpose. My Aunt Isabel. Not the glamorous aunt. Not one of my mother's polished sisters who treated reputation like religion. Isabel was my father's older cousin, 72, recently widowed, living in a rent-controlled apartment in Chula Vista, with a broken oven and a pension statement she did not understand. She called me one afternoon because, "You explain things without making me feel stupid." That sentence almost broke me. I went over on a Saturday with coffee, read through her pension paperwork, caught an error in the survivor benefit allocation, helped her submit a correction request, and arranged for a community legal clinic to review her lease renewal because the landlord had slipped in language he had no right to use. I did that for her because she needed it, because she treated my mind like something clean and useful, not automatic and owed. Because helping one vulnerable person is not the same thing as being consumed by a whole family system. That mattered to me. It still does. Adrian texted 3 times in the 6 months after I left. The first was defensive. The second was practical. The third just said, "I didn't realize how much sat with you." Not an apology, exactly, but closer than anything I had ever gotten from him. I replied once. "You didn't ask." My mother sent longer messages. Careful ones. Half apologies shaped like weather reports. "I'm sorry things got so painful. I miss how close we used to be. Families go through seasons." I didn't answer most of them. My father wrote once, 4 months later, "I wish things had gone differently." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I put the phone down and went back to reviewing a venue retention framework for a paying client who had never once called me dramatic for spotting risk before it cost them money. That was my answer. Not to him. To myself. What I learned is not especially poetic. It's actually very plain. Being useful is not the same as being loved. Being needed is not the same as being respected. And when a family has built itself around your willingness to quietly carry what they refuse to acknowledge, your boundary will always feel to them like cruelty first. That does not make it wrong. It usually means it is late. I used to think worth would feel obvious when it arrived, that people who should know you best would naturally recognize it if you just worked hard enough, stayed kind enough, fixed enough, proved enough. That is not how it works. Some people benefit too much from misunderstanding you to ever see you clearly on their own. So sometimes you stop explaining. You stop smoothing. You stop making their version of you profitable. And then you go build your life where truth does not have to beg for a chair at the table. That's what I did. I kept the bracelet. I bought the condo. I built Quiet Ledger into the thing they never asked enough to understand. And I learned that peace is not the absence of conflict. Sometimes peace is just the clean quiet that comes after you stop volunteering to be the invisible structure holding up people who never planned to thank you.